Okay, so we are getting ready to start our discussion for John 21, our last one. I mean, it just seems that was a long time ago when we started this study. It was
Different
very
world, a different world
it
ago.
was, and that's the other thing, it's completely different. So we want to start this week with, let's try to sort of recite together, if we can, our theme for John. So I'll do that thing where I'm going to say part of it and you guys just fill in the blank, okay? So John wrote a book of
Signs.
signs so that we would
Believe.
believe that Jesus is the
Christ, the Son of God,
Son of God, so that we would have
eternal life.
Eternal life. Good. And we got that from John 20, verses 31. And so that makes a great segue into us, besides him ending the chapter with that purpose for John, what else did you take away from John 20? What was it about? If you had a theme, or just what was the big event in John 20? Kind of a big deal.
Jesus resurrected.
Yes, Jesus resurrected. So anything that you would have, he's alive, he resurrected, the resurrection, the tomb was empty, whatever your inclination was to write that, that would be definitely something that we would want to know happened in John 20. And what did we say in general? What's the impact of that? Why did I say it's kind of a big deal? What did we talk about in terms of why that chapter has to be there?
Well, he defeated death, so if we have life in him, we also can look forward to the eternal part of him.
Good. Yep. Anybody want to add anything to that? That's good.
It proves everything he said.
Yeah.
You know, up till then, you know, you can get away with, oh, he was a good teacher. Oh, but if the resurrection is true, and it's not just hearsay, it's not just the Bible. I mean, there are facts that happen to prove it.
Yep.
One of them being the whole world changed at that point.
Yep.
It just proves everything that he said before, everything that he had stated he could do and would do in the future.
Good. So those two ideas combined, what B and Kim both told us, just make it essential. And if you read Paul in 1 Corinthians or anywhere else, that is that hope that we talked about in prayer. That's the hope, that's the good news. And that, as B said, we are throughout the New Testament told to be like him, that we are like him, that we will be like him when we see him, that we share in everything, as in that family relationship and the covenant relationship, that we share in his life, we share in sufferings, we share in death, we share in inheritance, and we share in eternal life. And if any of those pieces are gone, if the eternal life part's gone, then the rest of it doesn't matter. So good. So that was John 20. And you would maybe think, well, why doesn't the gospel just end there? And John 21 is just, for me, was just a great way for the book to wrap up, and a great way to look at something that's really important relationship wise. And I found it really fitting after spending a lot of time through all three parts of John, especially those early parts, looking at Jesus in terms of relationships with other people, that it was really a great chapter to remember how he deals with us and how he deals with people. So we're going to continue this story in John, and I want us to read it out loud. I remembered this week to have us do that. So are you all good to read if I just call on you in the order that I see you, like we do sometimes? I see Jasmine making an adjustment. Whoa, look at that. Jasmine just had an atomic flare in her room. All right, maybe just a solar flare, maybe not atomic. Okay, so if when you're reading, I'll start with B. If you would read, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 5 or 6 verses, maybe not 6, maybe 4 or 5. I think we'll get all the way around. Whatever feels good. And I'll try not to cut you off and do that a lot, I think. So, okay. All right. Go ahead, B.
After these things, Jesus manifested himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and he manifested himself in this way. Simon Peter and Thomas, called Didymus, and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and the 2 others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." And they said to him, "We will also come with you." They went out and got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. But when the day was now breaking, Jesus stood on the beach. Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus.
I'm Esther.
So Jesus said to them, "Children, you do not have any fish, do you?" And they answered him, "No." And he said to them, "Cast the net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you will find a catch." So they cast, and then they were not able to haul it in because of the great number of fish. Therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." So when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put his outer garment on, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. But the other disciples came in a little boat, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards away, dragging the net full of fish.
And Kim?
So when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire already laid and fish placed on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish which you have now caught." Simon Peter went up and drew the net to the land full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples ventured to question him, "Who are you?" knowing that it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and the fish likewise. Now this was the 3rd time that Jesus was manifested to the disciples after he was raised from the dead.
Okay, Aaron.
Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my lambs." He said to him again a 2nd time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Shepherd my sheep." He said to him a 3rd time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were younger, you used to gird yourself and walk wherever you wished. But when you grew old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will gird you and bring you where you do not wish to go." Now this he said, signifying by what kind of death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, "Follow me."
Karen.
Peter, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who had also leaned back on his bosom at the supper, and said, "Lord, who is the one who betrays you?" So Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, "Lord, and what about this man?" Jesus said to him, "If I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me."
And Jasmine.
Therefore, this saying went out among the brethren, that the disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but only, "If I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you?" This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books that would be written.
Okay. Well, we talked about that a little bit last week. That idea that John didn't write everything, Matthew didn't write all the things, Mark did not write all the things, and Luke did not write all the things. And you know what I think is interesting is, as we've talked and looked at the various gospel accounts, and sort of the focus becomes where they differ. Like, well, why do they differ? Why did they say this? If what John just wrote is true, that you couldn't even write them all down, I think it's actually pretty amazing that they actually covered as many of the same events as they did, because think of the choices they must have had. And so of course they were guided in the Holy Spirit by what God wanted them to write. But doesn't it make you just wonder what was left out? Like, what don't we know that he did when John says you couldn't even write them all down? So just more confirmation for me that it was put together exactly the way God wanted to, and just a miracle that we even have such a lineup of their account. So with that said, then we ended John 20 after the resurrection, and we know that part of the proof that Kim talked about came from sort of the things that Jesus did after his resurrection. And what would that be? What had he been doing that became part of the evidence for his resurrection?
Appeared to over 500 people.
Yeah, he was appearing. So we had that, we looked at that. We saw some in John, we looked at them in the other gospels, and then we read Paul's account giving us the amount of other people that he had seen. So as we look at John 21, how does it relate to John 20? What's kind of happening here? What's our setting, or what's the time frame at the beginning of chapter 21?
Just says after these things.
Okay, so after these things, which is one of our phrases, we kind of help us line things up. And what's the setting?
The Sea of Galilee.
Okay, good. So the NASB says Sea of what?
Tiberias.
Tiberias. But if you look that up, it is Sea of Galilee. So good. Thanks, B. That jumped that right in there for us. So if you want to make that note, if that helps you, you can do that. So they are at the Sea of Galilee. John kind of tells us in advance what's going to happen. But how does it start out? What's going on at the Sea of Galilee?
Guys are going fishing.
Okay, so some of the disciples are there. How many disciples are there? Were you able to count them up?
7.
7. So let's kind of see if we can list who we have. 2 are unnamed. So who are the 5 that we know are there then?
Peter, Thomas, Nathaniel, and James and John.
James and John, the sons of Zebedee. So if you didn't know that or don't have that note there, that'd be James and John, and then 2 unnamed. So there's 7 of them there, which is a good portion of them at this point, actually.
I noticed Matthew, the tax collector. That just occurred to me. He's not on the boat.
He's not listed there. So yeah, yeah, it's interesting to still watch this happen. And even in relationship here, even though we're going to talk about great advancement in the disciples or in one of the disciples, they're also still the disciples. So it's very interesting later on, I think, as well. So how do they end up going fishing?
Peter says, I'm going to go fishing.
Okay. And, maybe they just don't know what else to do, and that's what they do. So that's what he did. And when he said he was going to go fishing, then what happened?
The other
Well,
said, okay.
Okay, so we'll just go with you. We'll do that too. Okay, so when they went fishing, oh, go ahead, Kim.
Well, I was going to say, for some reason, and I don't know, it's a movie. It has absolutely no, truth. Well, I mean, there's truth in it. But, I watched the movie Risen last night. I've seen it before, but it deals with the crucifixion and somebody trying to verify.
Okay.
And this scene, it just struck me. Because they're told, they remember they're in Jerusalem and they've seen Christ, but then Mary reminds them that she was told by Jesus, go to Galilee and you'll see me there. So they all go to Galilee and they're looking for him. It's like, well, what do we do now? Well, we're hungry. Let's go fishing. It's like, you'll find us where we are. We don't have to worry about that. So, wherever we are,
true.
they'll find us. And it was that idea of, okay, we're here in Galilee. We do what we're told. No, we'll go fishing. He'll come to us.
That's true. That's a good point, that he'll find them wherever. And also for the fishermen, where did Jesus find them the first time?
On the boats.
on the boats fishing. So it's perfect. It's literally, again, perfect, of course, as God would make it perfect. It just takes us a minute or two sometimes to see how perfect it really is to go, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, though, even though it's their business, they seem to have difficulty frequently fishing. So what's the result of their night of fishing?
Empty nets.
Nothing.
Empty nets. They didn't catch anything, says they caught nothing. And so they finish the night that way. And then something happens at the break of dawn. The day was breaking. What happens then?
Jesus shows up
Okay, so Jesus is where, Karen?
on the beach.
He's on the beach. When they first see him, do they know who it is?
No.
No. And then I just see this interesting. How far away are they at this point? We learn later. I'm just thinking about this.
Is it 100 feet, 100 yards?
100 yards, but yet a conversation ensues here while they're still 100 yards away. It didn't even occur to me till just now. Who starts the conversation that happens?
Jesus.
Jesus. And what does he ask them? Basically sort of telling them with a question mark, but yeah.
You haven't caught any fish, have you?
You haven't caught any, have you? And of course they tell the truth and they say no. And then what does he tell them to do?
So throw the net on the right-hand side of the boat.
Okay. And you will find a catch.
And
So
you-
he tells them to do it and you will find it. And did they do that?
Yep.
And did they find a catch?
Yes.
Yes. And then what happens then? I guess maybe it's the result of catching the fish. It maybe sparked a memory, or I'm not sure. Maybe it's like a sign, right? So something sparks the memory, and who notices first or figures this out, or what happens?
Peter realizes it's the Lord.
John
And
said,
then
John
for
did.
some odd reason, he puts his clothes on and jumps into the sea.
Okay, so that, I know that part accurate. Peter does that, but who actually notices first? Look at the verse again. I
Oh,
think,
sorry. The disciple whom Jesus loved.
yeah, so I think some B and Kim were jumping in there to correct that. So at this point, we've always been kind of saying that's probably John. I'm going to jump ahead to the end of John 21. Do we actually have a better idea that this is John all the time when he says this?
Yeah.
Yes, because at the end of John, John tells us that this was him writing all these things. So pretty good indication. So yeah, John sees him and says it, which this is very similar to what happened at the tomb in a way, except John ran first. Anyway, always these two. But yes, Peter dives in to swim there. And what do the others do?
Come in the boat.
They come in the boat. So I find the Karen's a way of phrasing that very interesting, because I had the same thought. So I thought, he's already got his clothes off because he's fishing, but he put his clothes on to go in the water to swim to shore, which it might have been easier without them. But I guess, why do you think this doesn't really matter scripturally at all? It's just sort of an interesting conversation, because we know the details are there for reasons. Like, why would he put his, go ahead, Karen.
I just wonder if it was respect, maybe, to put your, like, you put all your clothes on to greet
Yeah.
someone important.
Yeah, Kim. Yeah.
I read something that said it wasn't so much that he had been like all his clothes were off. It was like they were loose, and so he girded them up and tied them so they wouldn't drag him down while he went in.
Oh, that's
One
interesting.
commentary.
That's one commentary, because Tuesday night somebody said that another commentary based on the original, the King James, says that he was fully naked. So in either case, those would both be good reasons that would explain this, right? Because you wouldn't want loose clothing. Exactly. You'd want it girded up. And yes, if 100 yards out at the Sea of Galilee, because I'm actually wondering if that's far enough if you're undressed to not be seen from the shore. So for sure, if you're fully undressed, you would want to put your clothes on also to go, especially if you're going to shore. So you probably, if you were scantily clothed or not clothed at all, would need the clothing. However, since a boat full of people were going to follow him, maybe his clothes could have come with him. I don't know. I just think it'd be easier to swim without the clothes on. Anyway, we kind of digress, but not really. You know, those questions, when you get them, kind of indicate that you're paying attention, right? You saw the details, and we don't know the answers, and they don't change anything important, but you know, we see the details, and it's fun to talk about them sometimes. So Peter dives in, the other ones follow on the boat, and that's where we see how far away they were. 100 yards, which, is somebody pointed out Tuesday night, is a football field. So Peter, I think, for me, swam a pretty good distance to get there. And again, it still shows Peter's, some of his qualities or characteristics, right? That sort of, what do you call the characteristics that led him to dive into the water versus just stay on the boat and help row there?
Could have been a lot of things. Spontaneous.
Spontaneous is one.
And
Yeah.
once John said it's him, maybe he needed to go see for himself.
Yeah. What other things does it make you think of or think might?
Impulsive. I always think impulsive. He just
Impulsive.
does
Yes.
without thinking.
Yes. Yes. He did that recently, right? You know, in the garden, you know, it was impulsiveness that acted with him. And we didn't have it in John, but is there another place where Peter is the one who's willing to go into the water?
When
Yeah.
he stepped out of the boat to walk on the water.
Yeah. So it was interesting in John 21, I was kind of reminded of various bits and pieces of sort of what are kind of recurring themes throughout the Gospels, and definitely in John. We have one, this fish idea is partly one, and now we're going to approach another one that brings up lots of pictures. So when they got to the shore, what do we see? What do we know is going on with the setup here? What happens to the next set of verses?
They saw fire and food, a fish and bread on it.
Okay, so Jesus has already prepared a fire, right?
Which gets me. The risen Lord is making breakfast for them.
Yeah, I mean, it's so practical that even his words to them in the next set of verses, right? What does he says? Exactly what we would say. What does he tell them?
Bring some more of the fish.
Bring some fish, and then
Come and have breakfast.
come and have breakfast. You know, it's just so underplayed, right? It's just so yeah, you almost can't even, you know, puts us in that position of thinking of him too much as a man. But then if you're in this route where we are, that he's the risen Lord, you know, we've just watched all this, and there he is making them breakfast. Yeah, and giving them a miracle in order to do it, right? Although he has fish and bread with him. So then what happens? What do we know else about this when he's having this breakfast with them? What other kinds of parts of the picture do we see?
I find it interesting that it lists the number of fish in there and that the nets didn't break. And I got to thinking, okay, Galilee is where Peter's from. Maybe he's providing for their families.
Maybe so.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Yeah, I mean, the number of fish, I thought the same thing. That's interesting. And the net didn't break. So that we're supposed to understand is a very big catch. I think that's interesting that both are there, because to me, when you picture a net of fish, I mean, I don't really do that, but I've seen it in movies and on TV. 153, is that what it is? That doesn't necessarily sound like a lot to me for some reason. I don't know why. But when you see the net didn't break, then I know that it was. I know that for what a net of fish should hold, that has to be a lot because of John writing that it didn't break. So yeah, I actually love those details. So he told them to bring some of the catch over. And then what did he do after he told them to come and have breakfast? What did Jesus do? Let's
He
get the
gave them some
details.
of the bread and fish.
Yeah, he gave them some. So we see Jesus again doing what here?
Serving.
Serving them. Yeah. And I think, in Kim already, he made them breakfast, he serves them breakfast. And at that point, what do we know their thoughts are? What does John say that none of them did? And apparently none of them were thinking.
None of them asked who he was, and that they just knew.
They knew at that point and they understood it. And is any of this, would this be bringing up memories or things in their minds, this setting? What do you think, B?
Yeah, that's what I wondered, is that it probably, a lot of this looked familiar.
Yeah. What are some of the events that we know about that maybe would have been brought to mind here? There's probably more than one.
5,000?
When he fed the 5,000, right? That fish and bread kind of repeated theme. And there's another occasion maybe that they would have thought about.
Last Supper.
The Last Supper would have been another one. Those two both, just from the book of John even, thought. And who knows, maybe he did this repeatedly. Maybe he cooked and served for them a lot. I don't even know. It's not the picture we think about as they travel around and did things, but they know at this point that that's who it is, and nobody questioned him. And then John tells us what information about this particular manifestation. And I know that if you guys were marking words, that one was repeated throughout here. Manifested is the word they chose to talk about these appearances. And first of all, what does John tell us? How many times has this been to the disciples?
Third.
It's the third time. So for us, and we know there's been more than that I would want to say to bits and pieces of them, but not bits and pieces of them individually, them in parts. So what times then would we know from John? Have we seen those two other times? Yeah. Karen, do you want to tell us what they were?
Yeah, when he appeared to the disciples at first without Thomas, and then when he appeared again in the same room, I guess. Was it the upper room both times?
Yeah, we think the same room. I don't know it says the same room, but we always, I guess, think the same room. So yeah, so those two appearances as a group, and then here there's a group of them, even though we know it's not really even here, the full group. But and we know there were lots of other appearances. John wants us to know that this was the third time this had happened. Did anybody focus on or look at the word manifest? Yeah, Kim.
Made known, made visible. That's what I had.
Yeah. If you guys wanted, it's 5319. And I didn't look at how to pronounce it. To me, it looks like Phaneroo, but it's Phaneroo. So I'm sure that in the Greek it sounds much better than Phaneroo, but that's what it looks like to me. Yeah, it comes from the word for light. So I thought that was really interesting. Its root is the word light. So literally that making visible as if it's been illuminated and a light shined on it. And so I think that's so amazing that all of a sudden in this chapter, he uses the word manifest instead of he appeared, he made himself manifest. To make plain, to make open view. So obviously visible, plain, lit up, whatever would make you think there. Oh, I like one of the words they have there. It says graspable, which is not a word we would use all the time. But when I see the word graspable, it makes me feel like they're trying to tell us that it's understandable and knowable. Like if this appearance is made manifest, then it's something that you can grab hold of. And so that's how clear it is by using the word manifest. Okay, and now we're going to get to sort of the heart of this whole chapter. They're having this breakfast, and then over the next set of verses, we're going to watch a conversation take place. And this was where where a lot of people focus and where our homework focused for sure is in this conversation that starts. So they're having breakfast and Jesus begins a conversation with just one disciple. Who is he talking to? Well, it says when they finish breakfast, so he did let them finish before he starts the conversation.
Peter.
It's with Peter. And so Jesus starts the conversation. So what does he ask him? So we're going to go through this just in the question and answer. And then we'll go back and break it all down by looking at the original. So let's just talk about the exact questions as we see them, questions and answers, and then we'll go back and do the work that you guys had to do with them. Okay, so what's the first question that we see in the Greek or in the English that John asked, or Peter? Okay, that Jesus asks Peter in the book of John.
Do you love me?
Okay, let's do it exactly as it is in verse 15.
Do you love me more than these?
Yes, do you love me more than these? Because there are some subtle shifts in questions, answers, and then in the directions or commands, or I think your homework called them admonitions that Jesus gives to Peter. So how does Peter answer the first time?
Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.
Okay, and then Jesus tells him to do what?
Tend my lambs.
Tend my lambs. Okay, verse 16, then he says, tend my lambs, and then he asks him a question. What does Jesus ask Peter in verse 16?
Do you love me?
Yeah, do you love me? And how does Peter answer?
Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.
Okay, so those, Jesus changed his question a little bit. Peter gave exactly the same answer. Then what direction does Jesus give Peter in verse 16?
Shepherd my sheep.
Okay, so he gives him a different instruction. Okay, the third question is the one that things change a little bit more, even as we see it, not fully, but we're going to look at that. So what question does Jesus ask? And this is why looking at the Greek or different translations is so important to us sometimes, because this is another one of those conversations that you don't understand why John tells us Peter feels the way he feels unless you actually look back and see what happened. Just like when we had the whole thing with all of the asleep versus dead and alive, all of that, you had to look at the Greek that in order to understand that conversation. And this is another one where the details just really become important. So Jesus asks him what question in 17?
Simon,
love me?
son of John, do you love me?
Do you love me? And then John says Peter feels how?
Grieved.
He feels grieved because Jesus asked him that third time. Now, we might be able to figure some of that out, but we'll talk about more. So when he answers, what does he say, though?
He says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you.
Okay, so he adds another phrase there. You know all things, and you know that I love you. And then what's the final instruction he gives him?
The same as on verse 15, tend my sheep.
Not
Well,
exactly.
Tend my lambs. Okay. Verse
Okay.
15 says tend my lambs. This one says tend my sheep.
Okay, so, and as we know, everything's there for a reason. And also those little differences kind of jump out at you when you're doing this precept way, when you're inductively studying and you're looking at words specifically. That's when you realize, wait a minute, these are all slightly different. These are slightly different questions and slightly different answers. So before we look at what you guys looked at, what would be some of the things that you might think if you were just reading this and before you look at a different language, if you were going to try to figure why might Peter be grieved, what would be some of the things that you would be thinking here, even without looking? Why might he be grieved by this third question?
Maybe he thinks Jesus doesn't believe him.
Okay, good. If you ask somebody a question 3 times, you're starting to think either they don't accept your answer or they don't believe your answer, right? And so
I want a different answer.
or they want a different answer. Yes. Yes. So interesting. Yeah. Anything else that you guys are thinking? What does it mean about the 3 times? What can we think about the fact that Jesus asked him this question 3 times?
Didn't
You
Peter
think
deny
actually-
him 3 times?
Go ahead, Jasmine. Yeah. What?
Didn't Peter deny him 3 times
Yeah.
after Jesus was taken?
So that denial of 3 times. So we can talk about what Jesus might have been meaning by doing it, but if that's ringing a bell in Peter's mind as well, then there's a recognition of every time you get asked that question, right? One other thing I want to ask you about before we go to look at the Greek, how does Jesus address him?
Simon.
As Simon, so is that part of his name? And then also, what does he add?
Son of John.
Son of John. So he puts his parenting with him, and I don't know for sure what that would mean or indicate. I just wanted to point out, any thoughts on that in the way he refers to him here?
Interesting that he calls him Simon, which is his name, versus the name that he gave him, Peter.
Yes. Yes. So yeah, drawing in the fact maybe of where he is right now, not where he is going to be. And so we watch this as sort of the beginning of that change in a way, from Peter, who we've watched and Jesus has watched, and then what is going to happen. And we get to sort of see this moment unfold, which is what you see if you read it in the Greek. And so what you did is list them, and then the homework had you look at just the word love, right, as it changed through that. So we're going to do that. But if you look at a lot more words here in the original, you actually learn a lot more things. There are more words that change here than just love. So let's look first. And so as we're going to talk about them, and then I'll bring up a slide for each verse that shows the language changes and what really happens. So when Jesus says in verse 15, "Do you love me?" what is he asking him in the Greek? This is what you guys had to look up.
He's asking about agape love, like real, to love dearly, I guess is my definition.
Okay. Anybody want to add to the agape there? Depending on where you go for this definition, you'll get a wide range of answers, and then you can kind of sum them up, or we've all heard them described in a different way. So let's hear some of your other thoughts on what agape love means when Jesus asked him the question.
I had, it's always defined by God. It's a choice or selection to love.
Okay.
A longing for, and then I cannot read this one word. Like, what is this word that I have here?
I have divine love.
Okay. The divine love is often how this is called in a short way. Yep. Anybody have more or a different way you've thought of this before? In the direction that Kim's heading with the definition, when it talks about selection and choice and life, it is the choosing to live by God's will, right? So as believers, when we choose to yield or submit or sacrifice our own wills and desires for God's, then we're engaging in that kind of love that he calls us to, which is difficult, the sacrificial love, right? So 1 John, when he says God is love, he uses the word agape. So when God asked Jesus to go to the cross, that's agape love. When Jesus went to the cross, that's agape love, because he set aside his own wishes and desires for our benefit. So that's one of the ways I've heard it described before as well, is the setting aside of your own will for the benefit of another person, right? So sacrificial love is another good example here. Did anybody have anything else?
I figured out what that word was.
Okay, what was it?
It's the love of reason and esteem.
Okay,
So it's-
yeah.
it's
So
a-
all of those things would fit this divine will, this choosing that, because a lot of times when you look it up, it says benevolence, but that's again, wanting the good of another person more than you care about the good for yourself. So Jesus says, Peter, do you agape love me? Will you put your will aside for everything that I ask you to do, right? Can you do that? Can you do God's will instead of mine? When Peter answers, does he say, yes, Lord, I agape you? No. What does he say?
You know that I love you.
Okay,
phileo me, you phileo me.
I phileo love you. And what does it mean in the Greek, that word?
Treat affectionately, befriend, like.
Okay. Sometimes it's described as
Friendship.
friendship, brotherly love, right? The love of friendship, or the affectionate friendship. It's a good word, right? It is actually a very good word. It's where we get the Church of Philadelphia. It's based on this brotherly love, this philos love. It's a very strong word. It's a great word. So I think sometimes, at least for me, we finish this story, we've heard the story, and in a way, it always seems kind of negative, right? When you know that Peter chooses different words, in a way, you feel like it's negative. But we're going to talk about what's really happening here. So Jesus says, do you agape love me? And he says, yes, I phileo love you. Yes, I love you, but I love you like this. Okay, what happens in verse 16? Any different? We'll talk about the instructions on their own here in a second.
The same. Jesus
Those-
asks, has agape love, and he responds with phileo love.
Yep, those two are the same, except he didn't ask him the first time, do you love me more than these? He just said, do you love me? The third time, what happens in verse 17?
Jesus uses the phileo love.
Okay, so Jesus changes the question and he asks him, do you love me the way you've been saying? And when Peter answers, he says, he changes his answer a little bit. He doesn't change the word, right? He uses phileo love, but what does he add in there when he says this?
You know all things.
You know all things, and you know. So we're going to talk about the word know as it was used, because it changes also as we go through. Before I bring up a chart for you, let's go back and talk about, well, let me bring up the first one. Let's go back to verse 15. And I will bring up something that will show you all the Greek if you need it or want to see it. I don't have the numbers in front of all of them. I do in front of some. I'm not sure why I did that, but so verse 15, Jesus asks, if you look down the second level, what he asks is, do you agapeo me? And there's a brief definition. Peter answers, you know that I love you, and he uses phileo. Let's look at the word know. When Peter answers, he says, you know that I love you, and the word there is, I again don't know how to say these properly in the Greek at all, but oida is what it looks like to me. This is just to have seen or perceived, just to know, just normal kind of, you know that I love you, you've seen it, I love you like this. Let's look at tend my lambs. We already know those words are different. Tend, lambs, shepherd, and sheep are all used throughout, but he changes the order. So tend is the word bosco. Looks like bosco to me. And it means feed. In fact, if you look at other translations, frequently they say feed instead of tend. I think we're sort of a disservice here when you use tend and shepherd, because we can definitely make them sound like they mean the same thing. But if you look at this definition, it says to feed, spiritually nourish by feeding people the word of God, and that it stresses feeding them his word, feeding them who he is. Again, these things really, when you see this, it puts together so many other pieces from the book of John that it just becomes so cool. So feed the lambs, and if you look up the word for lambs, you see that's all they have, those little lambs. That's exactly what it is. So this is the whole first set of those phrases in the Greek. So feed them. Why do you think the focus on feed the little lambs, especially when you see and you know what he means by feed and not the rest of the words for tending sheep?
Because the babies won't grow up healthy if they're not fed.
Right. You've got to really feed babies the nourishing food that they need in order for them to grow. Perfect. So when he's talking about his flock, I guess I didn't ask this question Tuesday night. Is Jesus talking to Peter about being a literal shepherd?
No.
No. What is he talking about?
The new Christians, the new people that will believe.
Yes, Jesus's flock, as he has already talked about in John chapter 10. Okay, good. So actually, that's kind of an important question. We didn't clarify it. I'm sure everybody knew, but so he says, feed those new ones, feed them, give them my word, tell them who I am, tell them about me. That's your job now, Peter. Okay, so in that second set of verses, I guess I could have just gone over a slide instead of closing it out. Let's go look at verse 16. Okay, so the questions stayed the same, including the word for no also stayed the same. But we know that the direction changed to shepherd my sheep. So we could probably figure that when they switch from lambs to sheep, what are they now talking about? What's the difference between a lamb and a sheep?
A
Normally.
baby and adult.
A baby and adult. Now, I will say the Greek calls them little sheep, not lambs, but little sheep, although commentaries have sort of a range of what they think the words are supposed to be here for the second ones. But here's the word for shepherd. I do have the number up there for you on this one. It's the full idea of shepherding that we have seen. Where have we seen the perfect picture of shepherding already this year?
John 12.
John 10, and in fact, some of us looked at an extra book talking about exactly what it means to shepherd sheep. So we have we did a lot of work on that, and you probably have a pretty good idea. But in general, it just means a full caring for that flock. And you see the word pasturing there. The reason it's pasturing is pasture in sheep for pasture. It's where we get the word pastor, is from pasturing or pastoring sheep. And it means guarding, guiding, folding, putting them in at night, bringing them in, putting them away. And in the Greek here would have the spirit directed guidance that is in conjunction with the feeding, right? So you're also going to feed, but you're going to do all that other caring, guarding, and guiding. So there's a difference between when the scripture just used the word feed and it used the word shepherd. Okay, questions or thoughts on any of that? As we'll continue to kind of summarize everything that we thought. Okay, so verse 17. As we've already said, Jesus changes the question to, do you phileo love me? And Peter says, yes. But when he answers this question, when he says, you know all things, you know that I love you, he changes no to gnosko. And he says, you know all things. That is that word that literally means know by experience. You know and understand me. Jesus, you have walked with me. You know everything about who I am. And so you know that when I say this answer, I say this answer. And then in the direction, he goes back to tend. He uses the word from lambs, which is feed, and then the sheep. So he has that instruction for actually the lambs and the sheep to be fed his word. And so as we finish those up, I just want to then now put that all together and talk about what your impacts or insights or what is happening here and what do you learn about Peter? What do we learn about Jesus or their relationship together by watching this conversation? What are your thoughts or impacts or questions?
Thoughts? I have just that I was thinking that Jesus was pretty much telling him, I want you to do to the flock as I've done to you.
Yes.
Giving them the word and then tending them, taking it further to deepen their knowledge and deepen their experience.
Okay, good. Good.
This could be totally off base, but it was something I spent some time this morning just rereading a few passages in John. I'm actually going back all the way through it and just making some more notes in my actual Bible rather than just on the observation thing. And just in meditating on some things, I was struck back to, and now my brain is fried about which, I think it's maybe 17, where he talks about tending the vine. When he's I am the vine and you in the vine dresser and that image of, I think if we look at it from the point that Peter had denied and might have had some doubt there, Jesus seemed to have taken him aside, lifted him up and talked to him specifically about, okay, this is what I want you to do. I want you to, just verifying, are you with me? Do you love me? You do, then here, go forward with it. It was like a special nourishment for Peter himself. He didn't, it's to me telling that he didn't do it to any of the others, that we know of. It was to Peter specifically because Peter specifically had done something that might have separated him from Jesus.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think it's chapter 15. I'm not positive, but I think 15. But yeah, good. So let's start on that track, right? What had just happened before? At the time of Jesus's arrest and trial, what did Peter do 3 times?
Denied him.
He denied him. So yeah.
Even knowing him. He didn't even
yeah, completely. So if there's a picture of falling away or cutting yourself off or walking away, there's the beginning of that right there. And so Peter could be feeling, imagine that you've done that. You think he's dead. First of all, you're happy he's back, but then also, what does that mean when you see him and you've denied him 3 times? How are you going to be feeling?
He'd be ashamed.
Yeah. To see him there, imagine all the things Peter's having to face. At the same time, the joy of him being risen, also with the fact of, oh no, I have to see you now and I've done this. So that idea combined here. So, yeah, so what do you think of this change in questioning? How can we look at what's happening here? If he's if he's building him back up, is this a bad thing that he changed the question? We think of it as he lowered the level of love, right? He lowered the level. What do you think about Jesus's questions and Peter's answers? What are you thinking is happening there in Peter's heart or mind and in Jesus's?
Well, to me, Peter's response of the phileo love or the friendship, brotherly love, that's what he can give now. when he's filled with the Holy Spirit, then he can give the agape love.
Yeah, okay. So it is what he give now. He's answering in a way. Do you think this represents a change in Peter already? How did we just describe Peter in terms of the Peter who dove into the water to go see Jesus, and all of those characteristics that represented the impulsiveness, the spontaneousness? I think one we didn't say was passion. What happened in the garden when the soldiers came up to Jesus?
Took the sword and cut off the one person's ear.
Right. So it's Peter who was also brave enough or bold enough when he had a sword in his hand to cut off. So we see a very brave, bold Peter. And so some of you, if you've got some questions, they kind of asked you to try to wrap up these ideas. You might need to turn to whatever question number that is as sort of your thoughts and looking back at Peter as Kim talked about. So this is the same man who, when he had a sword in his hand, went on the attack to defend Jesus. And yet 5 minutes later, half an hour later, he wasn't brave enough to say that he even knew him. So there's no longer a sword in his hand. Maybe that's part of it. I wondered about that. There's a difference between defending when you've got a weapon in your hand versus not. And how else is he feeling? What's the difference that you feel as you watch the person you have called the Son of Christ, the Son of God, when you've watched that person being led away in handcuffs and on trial? How do you suppose Peter would be feeling in those terms? Just in general here, I'm just giving you guys some lead questions. Just tell me what you have on your thoughts there, so we can kind of see what happens here in the relationship.
Well, just the fact that he follows him and wants to see all that, whereas some of them have already left. That's
a good point. Yep.
Mhm.
Other thoughts? What did you guys have down here?
I think it would have been a little bit, well, a lot sobering for him to watch all that happen, and then he's appearing, he's back to life. Because I thought of it as we were going through here. I'm like, wait a minute, they didn't have the English translation, they had the Greek, so it was obvious when Jesus was asking, do you love me, agape, and he's responding, he would have known he's responding with a completely different word, and he didn't try to cover it up or make it more than it was. He responded honestly.
Yes. So in addition to what Esther said, I think that that's a key there too. He responded honestly. And as he says, Jesus, you know I love you. You know I love you this way. And by that third time, he says, you know all things, and you know experientially. You know me because you've watched what I've done. You know me because I've walked with you. You know me from the beginning. You know what I did in the garden, and you know what I did afterwards. You know all those things, and you know I can't answer you with what you're asking me the first 2 times. You know, those thoughts, just, there's just such a beautifulness here to me about this conversation and about what we know happens with Peter later. And Jesus's willingness then to change that question and accept the answer, right? He accepts that answer. So it's not a bad thing, you know, it's not. And I think in my mind before, sometimes we can think, oh, you know, Peter failed again. But is Jesus looking at it as failure? If you look at here, no, because I think it's, if anything, it's a test to see, Peter, I'm going to ask you this 3 times to make sure that you are not going to be the self-confident, bragging Peter, who before might have just said, well, sure, of course I do, right? But now knows better. And so those are just some of my thoughts that's thinking of, it gave me a whole different way to look at Peter's answers here. And the truth, as Karen said, that's taking place here, the honesty. And then to look at Jesus who we know accepts the answers because he gives him the direction to care for whom? Who is he caring for? As we've said, it's not really sheep. Who is he caring for?
Other believers, the church.
Other believers, the church. This is the beginning of every command, everything we know that Peter is going to go do. Jesus tells him, here, take care of my people. Look at the possession there, right? My lambs, my sheep. You take care of them. You guide, direct, feed. As B said, everything I've shown you, everything I've done for you, I want you to go and do for those who are going to come follow like you. And follow is a key word here as well, right? And we see it in a couple more minutes as well, in the rest of this conversation, which again, that gets very real. So, what else do you guys think about Peter or Jesus here, their relationship and what you see or learn, or just something for yourself? Like, what's your takeaway after they had you look so deeply at this conversation?
I just found a real sense of, I don't know, like peace, validation that I am not called to be perfect in this, you know, that Jesus understands, God understands my attempts, and that sometimes I am going to fall, sometimes I'm not going to do the right thing, but that doesn't mean, again, you're cut off, that you have no hope. It's like, no, Jesus understands and he will bring you back. And then once you've repented of it, it's forgotten and you carry on in your work, my work, his work, you know.
Yep. Perfect. And that was really great, connecting it back to the vine thing, is that if you are one of his, which he starts, if you really are there, these are the things that will happen for you. You can fail, you can fall off. You can, you know, can you imagine anything worse as a disciple of Jesus than having denied him out loud those 3 times, in terms of, other than maybe what Judas did, you know, but in a way they're similar, right? Judas, it was a way of denying him. He sold him out. That in a way, if you deny him 3 times to 3 different people who ask you, you've done essentially that same thing. But Peter didn't run. Peter didn't leave. Peter didn't end the way Judas did. Peter even went to Galilee. He stayed. He had seen him. You know, I think I would be so wanting to go hide. Once I knew Jesus was alive, I would be joyful the way Peter was. But I think there's a braveness of Peter even to show up in the room. Not that they were ever expecting to see him in those places, but I would have just wanted to hide. And I love the fact that we have a God and we have Jesus who says, you don't have to hide. You just have to tell me the truth. Be honest with me and we can move forward, as Kim said. I love this conversation here. Yep.
I got, you know, going back to Peter, he strikes me as, for myself anyway, kind of the emotional one. You know, kind of like John is really understanding and kind of calm and following and easy. And Peter, like, I did a lot of study going back to Luke 5. I don't know if you guys already talked about it, but the first time that Jesus went out on the boat where the fishermen were, and he used that as a platform to speak, and then filled their boats with fish, or their nets with fish, and they filled their boats, and the boats were about to sink and all that. And then they went to shore, and then he said, you know, now you'll catch people, you know, instead of fish. And that was sort of the beginning. And then there's this like parallel between those 2 things. And when they were out there, you know, in the situation, they see Jesus on the shore, and John knows and tells Peter, and then Peter just dives in the water and swims to shore. You know, and in different times throughout, he always just like acts. And, and so it kind of reminded me of myself because I'm a really reactive person. It's like something like boom, you know, and so he just kind of seems to me like the kind of person that it's like, it takes a lot. It takes many beatings before it really drills it in, and beats himself up probably too about it. And, you know, and then I just thought it was interesting, like with the, you know, 3 times that he, you know, denied him 3 times. And then he was asked, you know, 3 times and a little bit in 3 different ways. Yeah. And there's this balance there where it's like, okay, you know, it's not an eye for an eye, but that sort of thing.
Yeah. Thanks, Mindy. That's perfect, because we didn't talk about that other event, that Luke 5, in addition to what happens here, this very similar event has already happened in their lives, this catching of fish when they hadn't caught any before. And this, at the same thing that happens then, Jesus gives Peter instruction, from now on, you will catch men. And so, and we didn't get to see that in John, and we never even got sent to go look at it. So there, and in this homework, we didn't get sent to go look at it. So thank you for bringing up which chapter it was in, and giving us that parallel. Again, as Mindy says, the balance, you know, the beauty, the parallels, the reminders for them, as he said, always, you know, you will be reminded of these things, you will remember these things. And we get to do that too. You know, as you look at the gospel accounts, as Mindy went back here and looked, you get to look and say, I remember that. And this is very similar, but another step in Peter's evolution of where he's going to go forward. But what we can look at sometimes as failure, and what, as Mindy said, Peter probably did on his own, Jesus didn't, you know, and that is such a big takeaway for us, that Jesus doesn't hold on to those like we do. He doesn't say you're unusable now, because, I mean, again, I don't know that we can imagine doing anything worse, although that he talks about that with us too. Don't deny me before men. Yeah, thank you. Other thoughts? I'm talking too much today. Not that that's new, but.
I could just add on to that too, that one thing that I found was that, you know, it's I'm not 100% certain, but that these fishermen, this is sort of where they fished in Galilee. Yeah. And it was almost like they were at the same place, doing the same thing, not catching any fish. Let's see what else I put down. Neither time they were successful at all. Like they caught nothing. Mm-hmm. It was almost as like he caused it or something to prove his point, you know. And then, you know, they ended up basically with more than enough. And when here, in this case, you know, when they came to shore, he was totally prepared for them. He had everything ready. He had bread, he had fire. He was like, I'm ready for you when you come to me.
Yes. Very good. I'm here waiting. Yeah. Another thought, you know, another thing. Good.
So, sorry, I've kind of jumped back a little bit.
No, that's good. Okay.
Started with Peter.
Yeah. Anybody else? We do have a couple more verses we have to go to. I always forget that there's a few more things we want to talk about before we wrap. I could just end with this part and just talk about it forever. So they have this conversation, and then before they even jump to the final section, Jesus ends back to sort of kind of the way that we've seen, where you're having one conversation and then he takes it somewhere else. In verses 18 and 19, where does he take this conversation? I'm sure in a way that Peter or anybody listening wasn't really expecting. What does Jesus tell Peter about?
Well, now looking at, you know, the words and just that idea that I hadn't thought of before with Peter answering about, I'm not able to sacrificially love you.
Yeah.
Then to me, it's like, oh, the segue makes more sense now. He's like saying, and the truly, truly, I love that because it's like,
Yeah.
this is truth. This is there. It's already happened, Peter. You know, this, what I'm telling you now is written. It's like, I'm telling you, you are going to have a sacrificial love. You know, you do this on your own and go wherever you wanted, but the time is coming when you get older. You are going to have to go where you don't want to go, but you will do it because you have that love for me. And that's, oh, I'm getting goosebumps just saying it.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, because again, what looks to us like something that doesn't make sense when you look at the original language, that, as Karen has said, they heard it in Greek, like they knew exactly what was happening. Every time Jesus asked one word and Peter answered another, they knew that. And here again, it is perfect then that Jesus says, but a day is going to come where you will have that happen. So this focus on the death that's going to come to you, which we might not have gotten, but John tells us that's what this means. And then Jesus says what? Again, taking them all the way back to the beginning of his calling, what direction does he give him?
Follow me.
Follow me, all the way back to the beginning. And you know, I don't think we ever talked about the word follow before, and I'm not positive it's even the same word he used, but I do want to give you the Greek here for the follow. Or did anybody else look it up? I never had looked. I think maybe because in John, I'm not sure that's where he uses it, but it's number 190. Again, I am not going to try to pronounce this one. I'll spell it for you though, if you want it. AKOLOU and then Theo, THEO. Theo, I don't know. I always try to do Spanish or Hawaiian pronunciation because their vowels are the same and I know them. But it really means to cleave steadfastly, conform completely to his example in living, and if need be, in dying also. So it means, again, and this makes perfect sense here, when Jesus says, follow me. You will live your life the way I lived mine, and you will die the way I lived mine. That's the commandment. So when we say that and think that, that's literally what follow means. It doesn't just mean follow behind me. It means do what I do, live my example, which is powerful, which we kind of know that's what it means, but it literally means that. Okay, so now we get back to the disciples, including Peter, even though there's some growth here, still being human and still being fully who they are. Jesus says, this is how you're going to die. You will someday sacrifice yourself for me. Follow me, do what I do, die like I do, live like I do. And Peter says, what? What's Peter's concern?
Lord, what about John?
What about John? What about the guy behind us? You know, we've seen the two of them sort of paired up a lot in scripture. What about him? And what Jesus answers, again, I love this because he answers very much in a phrase is something very similar to what we would say. What does Jesus say?
What is that to you?
Right. So I always think he says, what's it to you? Right. Because that's what we would say. What's it to you? Yeah. You follow me. So he repeats that. He says, what's that to you? And then he says this phrase, which of course ends up with some gossip or rumors later. What does he say about John? I think indicating if, right? He says if. What does it matter to you if I what?
Want him to remain until I come.
Yeah. So what happened in terms of what people thought or said, although John makes it clear what it meant here, and John would know, right? Because it's about him. People started to develop a rumor that what might happen.
That Jesus wasn't going, I'm sorry, that John was not going to die until Jesus's return.
Right, that John wasn't going to die at all, possibly. And what's cool here, though, again, this reminder, we talked about it with Paul, that when we talk about Jesus's return, when did the disciples think that that could happen?
And he did.
at
Any
any
day.
time. And Jesus here gives authority to that belief by saying, what's it to you if I keep him alive until I return? Meaning he's the one who gave them the foundation for that possibility. So when we talk about imminence, we talked about that in terms of the rapture, that is a concept, meaning it could happen at any moment. From that time forward, it literally could happen at any moment. There's nothing waiting for that to happen. And they had that belief. And we saw it in Paul. And you can see here Jesus giving them the reason for them thinking that. Well, John, I might just keep him alive until I come back. And so they would be thinking one of two things. Either he isn't going to die if it's a long time away, or Jesus could come back really soon, right? Really soon, which is, love to see that here. I love it that Jesus continues to talk about his future, even as he walked to the cross. And even now with these guys, he's talking about his future. We do know John did live to be very old, but he did die. He did die. Okay. And then we get the kind of two wrap-up statements here. One, in John 24, what does he tell us?
He says, this is me testifying to these things, and we know my testimony is true.
Okay, good.
And who wrote
So,
these things.
yeah, and he wrote these things and they're true. And so he sort of said that in John 1 as well. There's a lot of things, as you're still kind of pondering this over the next time, where you can take a lot of this right back to John 1. And it's almost like we could just have read John 1 and just been done. Like, because it's just this great summary of everything that he's going to talk about later. And then in John 25, we have that statement that we already talked about a little bit. What does he indicate to us about all the things that Jesus did?
There's just too many to write down.
Too many to write down. I suppose the world could not even contain them if we put them all in book. And again, it makes me wonder, wow, what don't we know? What didn't we see? We saw a lot of great things. So it's not like we're lacking in detail, but that just amazes me, literally amazes me that John, who walked with him, would say that. Imagine the lives that they lived walking with him when you know that, you know.
I got to thinking about the idea of, there's a lot in John especially that he sort of summarizes, like he was followed and he did a lot of healings. It's like, yeah, we had 3 years of thousands of people, hundreds of people following him and him just reaching out and touching people and healing them. So it's like, wow.
Yes. Yeah. So the summaries are well needed, right? It's just like, God gave me this to tell you. And so I'm not going to focus on those details, because his focus was very specific, that those signs would make us believe that Jesus was the Christ, that he was the Son of God in particular, and to have eternal life. And then one of the reasons why I don't know if I said this at the beginning or I said it in prayer, but that I love the fact that we're ending at Christmas, because that idea of him being Son of God is exactly what we're about to celebrate. He came as a baby. He came as the Son of God. And we're told that over and over in the Christmas story, right? And so I think it's perfect. It's just a perfect place to get to wrap up. So speaking of wrapping up, I just want to give time for all of you anybody to share either. I think everybody here did all of John, right? I had a couple people on Tuesday night who just joined us as of part 3. So they obviously didn't have any impacts from John 1 or John 2. But for you guys, I asked you to think about a takeaway statement. And it could be from John part 3 or something that happened earlier. You know, what are you walking away with, or what would you want to share with someone else, or how have you been impacted?
I have to go in just a minute, so I hate to just sort of spew my own thing and then have to leave. But there are 2 things that really struck me in the beginning. The first couple, first sections, it was the idea, this whole new picture of Christ that I got, of not I mean, he is a servant, but I think over time we've just gotten, oh, he's this wishy-washy shepherd who carries his sheep and la la la, and the in-your-face directness of who Jesus is, that there is no denying, this is who I am, this is how I'm proving it, and it's on you. You either choose to believe or you walk away, and that is the judgment. It's like, I am not come to judge the world this time, but I am the judgment. And that whole idea, and just so in your face. And there, you know, I grew up thinking it was he was just wishy-washy. He never actually said, but no, looking at the words that he used, he was very direct, and there's no, it's black and white. There's yes and no.
Yeah.
And then in this one is, again, I think more towards the end that I really get the idea of the compassion that he had for us, the strength, one, to willingly do all this, and that he was in control the whole time. My hour has not yet come. I'm doing this. I've been commissioned by my Father to do it, and this is what I'm doing, and nothing will stop me. Very direct. And then, but also underneath that is that compassion of, I'm doing it, and now I have to make sure you understand why and who you will be when I leave, because of this great love that he had for the disciples and for us through that. Is, and then with the scene with Peter, it's just so giving me so much hope and peace that even when I'm failing, as long as I'm trying to abide, he has compassion.
Yeah, thank you. Those are great. Those are great options.
Sorry, I have to leave.
Okay, all right, love you, bye. Bye. And she disappears. All right, anybody else have something they want to share? You take away from the book or this book?
It just kind of hits me that it's all encompassing, like through the whole thing, like Kim said, you know, Jesus is saying, this is why I came, this is what can happen, here's what's going on. And then he projects, you know, even beyond that. After I leave, I'm not just gonna leave you hanging, you're gonna get my Holy Spirit. And at the very end in this last chapter, you know, he gives them their command, basically, tend my sheep, look after my flock, follow me.
Yeah.
A really good whole picture of his life, I guess.
Yeah.
John did good.
He did a good job.
We were talking a little bit before class, Chris and I, and just that John is one of those books for like early believers, young believers, that if you needed a place to start, it's pretty it's all packed in there pretty neatly and easy to understand. And he's speaking a lot of it himself, so it's pretty open book.
Yes.
My takeaway was somewhat of my responsibility is to believe and know what I believe. And sometimes I feel like I have to have all the answers for anybody that comes at me with something or something like that. Well, I don't. It's my responsibility for me is to believe and encourage, help others to believe.
Yep.
I have a couple things. The division of the spiritual and the flesh, of how, you know, our understanding is just so limited until he opens our eyes and we can spiritually see. And it's so easy for us to live with what we can see. So like in, you know, the last year, with how difficult things have been, and what I see around me is falling apart, you know, in this world. I was just really convicted, especially going back to John 5. And he talked about how we receive glory from one another and not from God, which is where we should be receiving our glory from. And that just really struck me as, you know, it's just so easy to do that. It's so easy because this is what we see, this is what we know. But when we open up and we allow the spiritual aspect that this is the eternal spirit. That's what we're really going for. We're not what's happening here, what's temporary. It's temporary. And so we have to live and look at the
Yeah. Thanks, Aaron. Still hard, but he knows it, right? He knows it. He loves you, loves us. Yeah. Anybody else?
Is John, I didn't have enough time to go back and fully reflect, but it might be chapter 5 too, like Aaron said. Is that where the part that struck me was like if you cut off your hand, it's better to put out your eye. That I don't think that's even in John though. That maybe was a cross reference somewhere, that it's better to live without your eye if your eye is causing you to sin, or if your hand is causing you to sin, cut it off.
You're right. It is either, it might be in John, or it might have been in cross reference. John
It's a
5
while
is the
ago.
blind and the seeing, right? That's John 5. Is that what Aaron was referring to?
I was trying to flip.
Yeah, I don't have all of I only have I have such a limited, well, I don't have limited space, but I have limited space for me here. So I have my sheets and my binder is somewhere else. But yeah, if you guys want to look.
But that was one thing that, and I know it was in here somewhere. I know it was in Bible
Yeah.
study. We've been doing this for like a year and a half, so I'm positive
Yes.
it's something to do
Yes.
with John. But I've thought of that often, that when you're like Aaron, walking through life is really hard, but we are to choose the hard here so that we get the eternal reward. So that has popped in my head multiple times in it when Aaron started talking. I was like, oh yeah, that.
Yeah.
I'd forgotten for a little while.
That's a really good way to put that. That is one of those things that I've thought about over the last few years of our study, in terms of what's happening around us culturally, socially, or in families, where we're asked or we're called sometimes to say things to make people's lives easier, right? Or to say, well, it's okay if you do this. But that idea that, well, I can tell you that, but if I tell you that, you might feel good today, but you won't feel good eternally. And so true love would be to tell you what will make you feel good eternally and not just today. And so I think, yeah, that idea has popped into but that's a great, did anybody see where that reference is?
I don't think
yeah.
it's in John.
Yeah, we did cross-reference it though, because I do remember we did cross-reference that one from a chapter, and I don't even remember why.
Yeah, I can't remember, but I know that was one thing that really stuck with me somewhere. But I guess maybe it's not exactly from John, but
yeah, it would be better.
John
He
is
said,
what pointed us.
Yeah, it would be better to miss a body part than to not have the full, than to sin, than to walk away that you shouldn't. It would be better to have a missing body part.
Love that. I've used that with my kids and stuff too. And I had another Bible study instructor like 10 or 15 years ago. She said her mother would always say to her, in light of all eternity, what does this matter? And it really hits you in the middle of the forehead and puts things into perspective, because it doesn't matter at all.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't. I try to use that with my husband when he gets too worried about work. That, you know what, not even eternally, but 5 years ago, I'm pretty sure you had the same worries about a whole different thing, and it all resolved itself just fine. And you didn't get fired, and the world didn't end, and nobody died. And so, okay. Although I could have very well used that advice for myself when I was much younger and much more likely to worry about everything. So yes. Somebody 15 years ago,
Matthew.
I thought maybe Matthew. Where at, Esther?
Matthew 5:29, and then also again in Matthew 18:9.
Okay.
Thank you.
So that if you go there, that might give you the cross-reference for John. Like if you look at those verses, it might tell you where we saw it, why we looked at it in John. But yeah, that's an interesting takeaway.
I always keep coming back to the story of Nicodemus. I don't know why. I mean, I've known the story for a long time, but I think in light of John looking at who we so frequently see reaching out to Jesus are, you know, the needy and the poor, or the sick, and or just your average person on the street. And Nicodemus stands out as one of those people who seemingly had everything, who wasn't wanting, who had you know, a life that people would envy. And he was, you know, he had followers, and was supposed to have this understanding of the word, and he got it. He, you know, he realized that he didn't. He realized, I think, that that being a Pharisee wasn't everything. And you know, I was so looking forward to the end of John, because I didn't remember how the story ended with Nicodemus, and so I didn't cheat and I didn't go look ahead of time. But then you see him at the end, and he's, you know, helping with Jesus's burial, and you know, it's so uplifting. I think that if you think about it in terms of people, that it's all a heart issue, it's all a willingness to be receptive and to hear what God has to say, and you never know who that's going to be through. And so I think it's just encouraging to me that you know, if you see, or if you have people that are on your list, I think you combine the story of Nicodemus with the fields being ripe for harvest, and whether it's your job to sow seeds or harvest seeds, it doesn't matter, because they're all important jobs. It's your job to live your life and be an example. And even if you never see that come to fruition in somebody's life, your job may have just been to plant little seeds, and maybe somebody else is the one that gets to harvest. But just a beautiful picture of Jesus, and how it doesn't matter who you are or what you do, but it matters what your heart is. So
Yeah,
I like
thank
that
you.
story with Nicodemus.
Yeah, you know, that is a great reminder, because we always think of the lowly when we say it doesn't matter who you are or what you do, but you get the full picture by including Nicodemus in that it didn't matter who he was either. He still had to believe everything everybody else had to believe. It didn't matter that his life looked put together, that he was a leader, that he was rich, that he was a teacher. Yeah, that's really good combination. Okay, well, as usual, we have these past few weeks gone well over in discussion and left you in terms of prayer time. I know that gets mine had a bit of a abrupt pause as we got ready to wrap up our study and had our prayer time. And you know, I just want to encourage anyone who's watching online that you know what, if you're having a hard day, if you're struggling with a commitment, if you're struggling with your commitment to study the word, as we watched with Jesus talk to Peter, you know, he doesn't give up on us the way that we can give up on us. And I would just encourage you not to listen to the lies of the enemy, but know that if you're abiding in Jesus, if you love him and you believe, which is all he asks us to do, he is going to give you the grace and the compassion and the love that are his characteristics. And it isn't about perfection. And he knows your heart, and he just loves you so much. And he loves you so much that he set aside the glory of heaven and came down here as a baby with nothing to save you. And I just pray that you remember that as we approach Christmas. And next week, our classes would be having Christmas parties, and I might take some pictures or record that. And I will be recording, possibly today, a promo for an introduction to Isaiah, which will be the study we do next. So that is a blessing I'm looking forward to. And just praying that you are preparing your heart for the advent of the Son of God, Jesus, coming here for us, and also that you would continue to prepare your heart for the advent of him coming again and him taking us believers home. And so that is the good news, that we can comfort each other with these words, as 1 Thessalonians 4 tells us. So praying that, and praying you have a beautiful weekend leading up to Christmas. Bye-bye.